I'm working in a demo CPQ instance that has a client that's kind of an exemplar of the type of clientele that we would tend to see who might have a CPQ and NetSuite integration. So they're clients who, we're seeing the trend more and more that sell hardware and software and professional services, inclusive of things like warranties or maintenance contracts. So kind of that nice trifecta. When you have a client sort of with that type of business model, it makes a lot of sense that CPQ and an ERP like NetSuite would be in the fold. And for this client in particular, we've got in our demo instance, a product catalog full of equipment, services, and kind of installation and maintenance costs for these things. This is a green tech provider that has intelligent green tech that they're going to have to kind of install, set up, and run software for. So the login screen we have, just to orient those of you who might not have seen CPQ, it's really no different than Salesforce in that its primary orientation is making Sales Cloud the kind of the grand event, right? So for those of you who are just familiar with pipeline management, Salesforce Sales Cloud, the same concepts are going to still be really important, and the opportunity is still going to have a lot of centrality in the platform in that your pipeline, your revenue forecast is going to be comprised of opportunities. So we have a sample opportunity here. And what's a little bit different or unique, depending how you've seen Sales Cloud configured, is with CPQ, CPQ introduces its own custom quoting engine. So the model of how quotes and opportunities relate to each other, same as in normal Sales Cloud, is that for each opportunity, you can have multiple different quotes. You can have one, you can have two, you can have five, but you'll always only have one quote marked as the primary, such that it can sync back a dollar figure that you're actually including in your pipeline for revenue forecasting purposes. So if I were to quickly make a new quote, I'll kind of just launch it at the header level, usually trying to bypass too much information at this point. I'm kind of just trying to make a working draft for myself. But once I do create that quote, this is where I'm going to start kind of working the configuration from a CPQ standpoint. Right now, I don't have anything configured. It's just kind of an empty canvas for me. But once I hit the quote line editor, this is kind of the wizard that is the main event as far as CPQ is concerned. So the first thing I want to do is add some products to fill out my quote. I've got a feature called guided selling enabled in this instance. And what that does is it just provides a way that, if you're a company who's got thousands of different product SKUs, I can refine what I'm looking for, in this instance, software licenses that hit the enterprise segment, so that you can have different sort of suggested configurations or features that let you down select and hone in on what is most likely sort of applicable to that type of clientele. So for all things being equal, sort of helps narrow down what could otherwise be a super extensive catalog. Now I've got a software license that I'm going to need to activate across thousands of different units, in this case for wind turbines. So I'm just going to increase the quantity here to cover all of those units. All I've got really going on from a pricing calculator standpoint here is some volume discounts that I've enabled for this product SKU. So you'll see the list price of 120 per unit will go down pretty significantly once I hit a quantity floor like this. Just one of the many examples of ways that you can sort of program in some of those pricing and quantity-based automations into a CPQ quote. I'm going to set the start date for my prospective contract so that the license activation will span basically for the coming year should we win the business. And then once I've saved this, I'll see that some of those kind of core stats around list price, discount prices that we've kind of automated by virtue of those pricing discount schedules, since I had such a massive quantity. Those are all going to kind of factor here. And the end result of what I've done to the opportunity is, since this was marked as my primary quote, this value is now going to sync back to my parent opportunity. So back here now I'll see that $157,000 prospective sale in my pipeline. Okay. Once we would be closing this out, if I were to close win, what that's going to do is basically Salesforce is now setting up to order and to contract this opportunity. What that means is the order is essentially the sales order. And this is by far the most common integration point when we're kind of talking about the handoff between a sales or CRM system and an ERP. Sales orders are essentially the sales receipts, and the contract that I've now generated is the module that's kind of tailored towards any kind of recurring revenue. So you'll see now in relation to this, I've got just that one order, but I've also got a contract which is made to accommodate multiple possible orders. So the meaning of that is if I were to increase the units and I wanted to co-term them, if I were to have a change order during the term of this contract, if I had additional sales, much like how folks might acquire new licenses during the term of their Sales Cloud, they want to acquire Pardot. Well, if I were to do that, I could have a new opportunity that gets compended to the same contract. So these are kind of the modules that have greatest significance when it talks about, when it comes to talking about a potentially Salesforce and ERP integration. I would sort of expect to find these represented in most systems, and one or the other is likely to be the integration point. So I'll go ahead and finally sync this over to NetSuite so I can create my sales order. And this is sort of the downstream one-way integration flow that rounds out our Salesforce setup.
And Brian, we got a question asking if this was all native Salesforce or native CPQ. Can you maybe add some color as to what would look different for a client that doesn't have Salesforce CPQ in this process?
Yeah, so what CPQ does is it gives you a point and click way to have things like I showed how when I did 1880 units, my price went down from 120 to 84. That's a rule that I've programmed into the back end. Now, visually, just in terms of navigating through Salesforce and Sales Cloud, it doesn't look different. It's much the same, and the consequence of my successful quoting is the same, meaning by virtue of a successful quote, really it's just tying back a correct dollar figure to Salesforce. Now, for orders and contracts, these are things you can manage with or without CPQ. So some of our clients will in fact have normal Sales Cloud without CPQ. We'll still use an order and a contract module basically to manage elements of recurring revenue, like for SaaS clients, anyone who has a subscription or a software license, and an order basically to create the sales receipt that we're going to pass down to an ERP. So these can be present regardless of if you have native Salesforce Sales Cloud or the more sophisticated CPQ licenses. Okay, so
another question super quickly, actually, Brian. Does Sales Cloud offer guided selling?
No. Guided selling is a feature of CPQ.
Thank you.
Okay, well, with that successful Salesforce sales order that I've created, we'll pass it on to Larry, who will show us how one would pick up and kind of finish fulfilling and processing that order in NetSuite.
Thanks, Brian. We'll start off where Brian kind of left off this in Salesforce. With the successful transmission that Brian did, I can go over to my NetSuite environment. Now, in your NetSuite environment, you can have a decision point at this junction of the integration. Do you need to approve the order even though it's closed won in Salesforce, or do you need that additional control gate? That's some things that you want to think about when records are passed into NetSuite, is whether or not you do need that extra control gate. In my scenario, I didn't put that additional control gate in there. I had it pre-approve as it comes into NetSuite. So his is within one of my 21 in my sales orders. So I'll just pull up his sales order. So this sales order is already approved. NetSuite's telling my AR team that the sales order is pending billing. You can see I have the identical customer that we both share and his product to NetSuite items. So one of the flows that it's important between the two systems to have is if you're selling one thing out of one system, you want to make sure that the product is also in your ERP system. I have way more information than Brian about this product from an accounting standpoint. I have the income account that this will hit in the end, and other important kind of ERP and specific attributes from an accounting standpoint. I can also see by the sales order his quantity rate and the term of which these licenses will cover. So this will cover the term between February to January to 2022. In my simple example here, I do not have a billing schedule, but you could attach one in NetSuite to let the system know that perhaps I'm billing on a quarterly basis, so 1/4 over a period of time, semi-annually, or some custom schedule that you might have to let the system know it's okay to bill. In my scenario here, I'm just going to invoice the entire amount up front and let my AR team take over. So I can bill the remaining amount here, and it's going to transform this sales order into a NetSuite invoice. For those new to NetSuite, a sales order is a non-posting transaction, so there is no GL impact at that point in time. All my information is brought over from the sales order, so my AR team or whoever my group is invoicing, they don't really need to add any additional information unless you have something specific that you want to add to the invoice that may not be resident on the sales order. So I now have an invoice that is created from this sales order. So there's a nice little tie. So you have a nice little trail of your transactions. Most importantly, this has a GL impact, and we can quickly look at that for the accounts as I'm controller. It's debiting my AR, but as you can see, it's also crediting not my revenue account, but it's actually deferred this amount because I have advanced revenue management in my NetSuite system. It knows that this is a software licensed product that I need to defer the revenue in its entirety until service is rendered. So we can go and look a little deeper in that. But from the invoice standpoint, I can print a copy and also email a PDF version to my customers for viewing right away. You can do bulk processes that do mass mailing on a day-to-day, or you can be part of your mail out, and you can mail it right out of NetSuite and control the threading there. So if your client responds, you'll see that threading in there as long as they continue replying to that email. There are important things to think about. Perhaps you want to, in your integration, to think about return trip data. You might want to bring over the invoice number so that when the invoice is created and billed, you might want to bring that little bit of information back to Salesforce, or even provide this URL back so that perhaps someone in Salesforce can view the invoice, maybe allow them to print a copy, maybe give them a view only so that they not be able to edit it, or just know that there's an invoice 248 sitting in my ERP system, or when your sales team is discussing with the client, he or she also has a visibility that there's an existence of this invoice that's attached to that one order over on Salesforce. So things to consider. I think Jeff mentioned it earlier about looking at your field mapping, deciding who is going to be the master or the source of truth, deciding whether it's going to be unidirectional, and also things that are happening on a return trip basis. So my AR team can go and accept payments, and they can do their functions normally. If I go back to my sales order, we're gonna have a look closer at it. It's now told me that I'm billed, which is correct. Invoice is out, and my AR team's doing their thing. But I'm going to switch my hats. I'm going to jump in as a revenue manager role, and I can go and say, okay, we have this new sold deal. I want to see what's happening with the revenue recognition and my deferral of this license. So with advanced revenue management, NetSuite creates an additional record during this time when the sales order is approved called a revenue arrangement. And I'll open that into another window so I can kind of see both. Revenue arrangement is a separate transactional record, best to kind of view it almost like a contract of your obligations with your client. So it has your customer. It allows me to look at revenue elements that are within this arrangement. So I have this customer, this product coming from this order. It gives me all my information that came over from the order, the revenue recognition rule that was attached to the item, which tells the system, how am I going to recognize the revenue? When do I recognize the revenue? And on what action? This simple 12-month rule is just going off of my start date of my engagement. And it, as the name says, it's just going off of a 12-month term, effectively just taking my total amount, dividing it by period, 1/12 each period that I can recognize as I progress through their contract. If you have more complex scenarios where you're doing software, hardware, support bundling, NetSuite is 606 compliant, and you can create those bundles in NetSuite, put fair value in, and NetSuite will do a two-step recognition, initial recognition, and then it will do a reclass. Now, I'm going to update my revenue plans as my revenue manager role. I want to see, what does this contract look like going into the future?
And Larry, we had a quick question related to where you just were. The question, will sales orders generated through Salesforce automatically pull in sales tax when applicable? And will sales tax be included in Salesforce or only in NetSuite?
Okay, good question. Another integration talk, if you have Avalara running, best practice is always to have them running on both sides, so that if you are sending customer facing artifacts out of Salesforce and NetSuite, that they're calculating the same taxes. This scenario here I have is non-taxable, but I could also run the NetSuite tax engine against here. It would book the liability, and it would be on the order itself. If I go here, we can see that I have no tax total, and normally I would have either a tax code based on the shipping address of my customer. But you'd want NetSuite to calculate its own taxes in either way. That's why the shared Avalara account is very common. We're seeing in a lot of NetSuite to Salesforce to NetSuite customers. They'll have one Avatax instance where both are feeding into, or both are calculating themselves, so that you don't have that discrepancy. Now, as revenue manager, I can say, okay, I want to look at my plans. The revenue plans represent the schedule, or what you might be putting in normally in your Excel to say, okay, this is when I need to do my actual journals. Because if you remember the GL impact of the invoice, it deferred the entire amount of the invoice into my deferral account. Over time, I want NetSuite, and NetSuite ARM will do it for me. And excuse me, this is just a pop-up. Will generate a revenue plan for me based on everything that it consumed. So it knew the rule to follow, which was my 12-month recognition rule, and it generated this planned revenue schedule. So it knows that starting in February 2021, I'm going to recognize $12,147.69. It's going to move it out of that deferral account and move it into my target income account, which is defined on the item itself. Over time, your revenue manager can come back to this plan and see the journals and when it was actually posted. So this will lead you back to the journal that actually had this GL impact. And I can see all 12 periods going into the future. So great tool for those that might still be on NetSuite and using the old legacy revenue recognition. You had this schedule, but I have much greater control. I have a discrete record now versus something that is attached to the sales order. And if I need to make any adjustments to the contract on the fly, I don't have to like stop the transaction, rebuild it, or do other scenarios that, you know, back in the old days that you had to. So much greater control, 606 compliant, which is very important for a lot of software and SaaS companies out there, especially if they're offering support. Speak with your auditor for information about your level of compliance and needs. But NetSuite has done a great job making sure that it's become a leader in this scenario. One thing before I pass it over to Jeff to bring up, in that approval process of the sales order, I have other clients, and this is another integration point that you could consider, is if you have a external license manager that you're running to provision this software, you could have it then NetSuite communicate to your license manager to say, please provision this client 12-month, this product, options ABC, whatever the case may be. And that information could also return to NetSuite in the form of like a fulfillment record or even a custom record, depending on if you want to store license information, license keys in NetSuite, if you need that kind of return trip information.